Welcome. You have been told a comforting lie. You know the story of a queen, isolated and misunderstood, who learns to let it go and embrace her power. You know the tale of sisterly love thawing a frozen heart, a billion-dollar fantasy of empowerment and acceptance. But this is just a glittering layer of ice over a chasm of much older, darker truths. The original Snow Queen is not a sympathetic heroine. She is an ancient parasitic entity, a collector of children, a merciless force embodying the cold, passionless void. This is not a story about mastering your fear. It is the story of being consumed by it, of the true child-stealing monster the world paid to forget, and the psychological horror it leaves in its wake. Her name was Gerda, and she was not a heroine. She was a girl built entirely around a single, gaping vulnerability, her desperate, codependent devotion to her younger brother Kai. Her entire identity was woven from the threads of being his protector, a role she clung to with a pathological ferocity that blinded her to his own growing resentment. She didn't just love him, she needed him to need her. Every moment was a quiet terror of abandonment, a fear she soothed by smoothing his hair, mending his clothes, and wrapping him in a love so thick it had begun to suffocate. This desperate need to be his rescuer was a weakness, a raw nerve pulsing in the cold, and the queen could smell it from a world away. Their world was not a kingdom, but a cramped, damp cottage pressed against the teeth of a vast, lightless forest. The air inside was heavy, smelling perpetually of wet wool, old soup, and chimney smoke that never quite cleared, stinging the eyes. The only sound was the constant scraping whisper of dry branches against the window glass, a sound that felt like fingernails on slate. Outside, the snow was not a pure, clean white, but a bruised gray-blue in the perpetual twilight, and the wind carried the taste of iron and frozen earth. This was not a land of magic, but a place of claustrophobic cold, a small, fragile bubble of warmth waiting to be extinguished by the suffocating silence of the woods. The fight was inevitable, born of Kai's burgeoning will and Gerda's suffocating care. His voice, cracking with rage, finally spoke the truth. "You smother me. I hate you." He fled not just into the snow, but away from her. And as if summoned by his cry, the world dissolved into an unnatural, silent blizzard. The wind didn't howl, it whispered, and in that whisper Gerda saw a glint of impossible light. A sliver of ancient, cursed glass driven by the wind struck Kai. It didn't cut him. It inserted itself into his eye, a tiny, cold violation. His cry stopped. His face went slack, logical, and cruel. He looked at Gerda's tears and laughed. "How messy," he said, just as the beautiful woman in white appeared. He saw her as an escape, and he went willingly. Gerda's scream was a solid, frozen thing in her throat. There was no thought, only a primal, panicked instinct. She ran, her bare hands already numb, her feet breaking the thin crust of snow. The sleigh's tracks were already vanishing, smothered by the driving wind. She reached the edge of the deep woods, the boundary marked by ancient rune-covered stones, slick with hoarfrost. Every village tale warned never to cross them, whispered stories of children who walked past the markers and were never seen again, or who returned years later with their eyes hollowed out and their hearts turned to ice. Gerda didn't pause. She plunged past the stones, trading the hollow for the abyss, her desperate, flawed love pulling her straight into the trap. Her flight from the sleigh's tracks was a blur of panic, a desperate, lung-searing run that ended not in exhaustion, but in confusion. The blizzard simply stopped. As if she had passed through a wall, she found herself in a place that should not exist. A garden, blooming with impossible oversaturated flowers under a warm golden light. The air was thick, humid, and cloyingly sweet, a perfume of lilies and overripe fruit so dense it felt like swallowing velvet. It was a shocking, unnatural pocket of summer heat pressed into the heart of a deadly winter, and the sudden warmth after the biting cold felt less like a relief and more like a violation, a fever dream settling over her skin. An old woman emerged from a cottage woven of living branches, her smile a web of comforting wrinkles. She was the image of every grandmother from every childhood tale, exuding a scent of baking bread, damp earth, and something else, something metallic and sharp, hidden beneath the chamomile. She offered shelter, her voice a soothing, reedy hum. "You poor frozen bird," she cooed, her eyes milky with cataracts, seeming to look through Gerda rather than at her. "You are safe here. Let me help you forget the cold." She offered Gerda a small steaming cup, a sweet spiced drink that warmed her from the inside out, an insidious comfort that began to blunt the sharp edges of her panic. The woman guided Gerda inside, sitting her before a crackling fire that gave off no smoke. She began to comb Gerda's long, damp hair with a smooth ivory comb. With every pass, Gerda felt a strange, blissful lethargy. The image of Kai, his face cruel, the sleigh, the endless white, it all began to feel distant, unimportant, like a story read in a book long ago. The combing was rhythmic, hypnotic. The woman hummed a tune that seemed to physically pull the memories from her mind, replacing them with a warm, empty peace. Gerda's terror of abandonment simply dissolved, leaving only the scent of flowers and the desire to sleep in this perfect, safe, warm place forever. Days bled into one another in a hazy, golden stupor. Gerda drifted through the garden, her mind a placid pool, empty of all but the simplest observations: the unreal red of the roses, the weight of the peaches on the bough, the softness of the mossy ground. There was no Kai, there was no fear. There was only the garden and the old woman's gentle care. But this unnatural peace had begun to curdle at the edges. The flowers, she noticed, never wilted. The fruit, when it fell, did not rot. It simply lay perfect and untouched on the ground. The bird song that filled the air was always the exact same melody, repeating on an endless perfect loop. The illusion fractured one twilight. Gerda, drowsy from her sweet drink, was sitting by the window when she saw the old woman exiting the cottage. She was not humming. Her kind face was a mask of grim efficiency. She was dragging something from the shadows of the woods, something small and pale, wrapped in a canvas sack. It was heavy, and it left a shallow, dark smear on the moss. The woman grunted with effort, pulling the small, limp burden not toward the garden, but toward a heavy oak door set into the earth at the garden's edge. A cellar Gerda had never noticed before, hidden beneath a curtain of thick, flowering ivy. A sliver of cold, sharp reality pierced Gerda's magical fog. The name Kai surfaced in her mind like a drowned man gasping for air. She waited until the old woman was back in the cottage, the sound of her rhythmic humming resuming its hypnotic drone. Gerda crept to the cellar door. The air here was wrong. The cloying sweetness of the garden was gone, replaced by the acrid sting of preserving chemicals, the dry, dusty smell of old linen, and beneath it all, the unmistakable cold, waxy scent of the morgue. Her hand trembled as she lifted the heavy iron ring, the metal shockingly cold, a memory of the world outside this feverish warmth. The darkness below was absolute, but the smell was a physical guide, a putrid thickness in the air. Gerda fumbled, her hands finding a lantern and a striking flint. The small flame caught, pushing back the shadows, and revealed the old woman's true gardening. This was not a wine cellar. It was a collection. Dozens of small, pale bodies lay on shelves, perfectly preserved. They were failed children, the ones who had resisted the queen's cold, the ones who had thawed slightly, their imperfections making them unsuitable for the palace. They were not just bodies. They were grotesque dolls, their eyes and mouths sewn crudely shut with thick black thread, as if to trap their warmth or their screams inside forever. This was no sanctuary. This was the queen's processing floor, her grotesque nursery. The old woman was not a savior. She was a groundskeeper, a butcher, tending to the rejected stock, preserving these imperfect toys so they would not rot and spoil the illusion of the garden. Gerda saw a small, half-finished doll on a workbench, a needle still threaded, and the sheer methodical cruelty of it shattered the last of her stupor. The sweet drink turned to bile in her throat. She understood. The woman hadn't been suppressing her memory of Kai to be kind. She was fattening Gerda, making her placid and forgetful, waiting to see if she, too, would thaw and need to be sewn shut. The horror gave her a strength the drug could not contain. She scrambled up the stairs, bursting out of the cellar and into the golden artificial light of the garden. The old woman was there, her kind mask gone, her face twisted in a snarl of annoyance, like a gardener who had found a rabbit in her lettuce. She held a thick, curved needle, the same black thread dangling. Gerda didn't wait. She bolted, crashing through the perfect, unwilting rose bushes, their thorns tearing at her clothes. She ran for the edge of the illusion, back toward the bruised gray-blue snow. The memory of Kai, now a screaming raw wound in her mind, newly infected by the image of those sewn-shut mouths. The journey that followed was a descent into a new kind of hell, a landscape that became more alien and hostile with every step. The snow gave way to vast plains of black ice, sharp as obsidian, that sliced her boots and cut her hands when she fell. The wind was no longer a natural force, it was an architectural one, carving the ice into impossible shapes that seemed to follow her, to watch her. The cold was a physical weight, a crushing presence that didn't just numb her skin but seemed to be sinking into her bones, trying to freeze the very marrow within them, seeking the same stillness she saw in the garden cellar. And then she saw it. The Queen's palace. It was not a castle of fairy tale turrets. It was a cancerous growth of ice, a non-Euclidean nightmare of impossible geometry that hurt the eyes. Spires twisted at angles that defied physics, walls curved in on themselves, and the entire structure seemed to shimmer as if it were not entirely there. It was a place designed to break the mind before the body, a monument to a logic so cold and alien it was indistinguishable from madness. It was not built. It had been willed into existence, and its very presence was an insult to the natural world. She stepped inside, and the silence was absolute. It was a dead, pressurized void that smothered all sound. Her own ragged breath was an intrusion, the moisture freezing instantly and falling to the crystalline floor with the sound of tiny, tinkling shards of glass. This was the source of the cold. It was not an absence of heat. It was an active, predatory presence, a thing that radiated from the black ice walls and sank its teeth into her. The air tasted of ozone and frozen ancient dust. There was no life here. There was only the perfect, terrible stillness of eternity. The word Kai had been tasked to assemble. The palace was a labyrinth, but not one of walls. It was a maze of perception. Corridors of polished ice reflected her own image back at her, but distorted, her face gaunt, her eyes wide with a terror that wasn't quite her own. Stairs led up to platforms that were somehow below where she started. Doorways opened onto the same room she had just left, only now the dimensions were subtly wrong, the ceiling too low, the far wall too close. It was a trap for the mind, a place designed to dismantle her sanity, to make her run in circles until her hope and then her heart froze solid. The psychological torment began. The queen's voice, the sound of wind chimes made of bone, did not come from one place, but from the ice itself. It was inside her head, whispering from the very walls around her. "He begged me to take him away from you," it hissed, the melodic sound physically painful, like needles in her ears. "He was so tired of your suffocating, messy love. He saw me, and he saw perfection. He saw release." The words were a new kind of cold, sliding into her mind, seeking the cracks in her resolve, twisting her love into a weapon against her. Gerda's mind began to fray. She clawed at the ice walls, her nails breaking, leaving bloody smears that froze instantly. She screamed Kai's name, and the perfect, dead silence of the palace swallowed the sound before it had left her lips. She was trapped, not just in a building, but in the queen's cold, vast, and logical mind, a place where messy human emotions like love and panic were nothing but glitches to be isolated and starved. The palace was a reflection of the queen's internal world, beautiful, perfect, and utterly, lethally empty. She began to doubt her own memories. Had Kai been afraid? Or had he looked relieved? Had she been protecting him? Or had she been his jailer? The queen's whispers were relentless, a cold scalpel dissecting her identity. "You are the monster here, little Gerda. You, with your hot, selfish, demanding heart. You are the thing he ran from. I simply gave him the sanctuary you denied him." Gerda slid to the floor, pressing her hands to her ears, but the voice was inside her now, and it was using her own doubts against her. She was the imperfection. She was the one who didn't belong. Just as the last sliver of her hope was about to extinguish, she saw it, a tunnel. Unlike the impossible, shifting architecture of the palace, this was a simple, rough-hewn passage of rock and ice leading downward. It felt different. It felt real. A gasp of relief, painful in the frozen air, escaped her. An escape route. A way out. She scrambled into it, her heart pounding with a sudden, desperate belief that this was the end of the nightmare. She ran, half falling, half sliding down the dark, sloping passage toward a pinprick of white light in the distance. The tunnel opened up, and she spilled out onto nothing. It was not the forest. It was not escape. It was a perfectly flat, endless white void, a floor of smooth, unmarked snow stretching to an impossible horizon under a starless, pitch-black sky. There was no sun, no moon, yet the void was lit by a cold, sourceless light. She ran, but the horizon never changed. She looked back, but the tunnel was gone. She was a rat in a frozen maze, an insect on a vast white plate. This was the true trap, a sensory deprivation chamber the size of a universe, designed to annihilate the self. The despair was total. This was not a prison of ice she could break. It was a prison of concept. She was nowhere, and the queen's voice returned, no longer whispering, but booming from the black sky above, a sound of pure, cold amusement. "You see? There is nowhere to run. There is only my world, and in my world you are a flaw." Gerda collapsed onto the perfect snow, her sanity finally fracturing, the cold not just in her bones, but in her soul. She was beaten. She was a messy, chaotic thing in a world of perfect, sterile order, and she finally understood that she had no power here. It was only then, when she had been fully broken, that she was allowed to find him. The void shimmered, and a new path opened, not one she chose, but one that was presented to her. It led to a vast central chamber, a throne room carved from a single, mountainous piece of black volcanic ice. The air was so cold, it was like breathing in powdered glass, each inhalation a tiny, razor-sharp cut to her lungs. The silence here was different. It was the silence of a cathedral, heavy and expectant. And in the center, a single, pale blue figure was kneeling on the floor. It was Kai, but it was not. His skin had the pale, waxy, blue-white luminescence of deep glacial ice. His lips were cracked and the color of ash. He was perfectly still, save for his hands, which moved with an unnatural, fluid precision. He was not playing. He was compiling. He was assembling intricate, razor-sharp shards of ice into a complex pattern on the floor. It was a word, she realized, a word he was building with the detached focus of an automaton. Eternity. He was a perfect, silent, obedient thing. His humanity bled out of him and replaced by cold logic. She whispered his name, the sound emerging as a dry, broken croak. He did not look up. His focus was absolute, his task all-consuming. She stumbled forward, her legs numb, and fell to her knees beside him. She reached out, her raw, red, warm hand touching his arm. He flinched. He recoiled from her, a sharp, violent spasm, as if her warmth had burned him. He looked at her, and there was no recognition. There was no anger, no love, no fear. There was only a cold, logical assessment of an interruption, an imperfection in his perfect, silent world. "He is beautiful, is he not?" The voice was no longer a whisper, but a physical presence. The queen appeared, not by walking, but by coalescing from the shadows of the throne. She was statuesque, 7 feet tall, her skin shining like frost on glass. Her movements were unnervingly fluid, her beauty so perfect it was inhuman. Her voice was the melodic, grinding sound of icicles, a harmony that was physically painful to hear. She was not a person. She was a concept. She was the void given form, and she was looking at Kai with the pride of an artist. "He is perfect now," the queen whispered, the sound vibrating in Gerda's teeth. "Unburdened by your chaotic, messy emotions. No more fear, no more anger, no more of that selfish, grasping love. He is logical. He is silent. He is eternal." Gerda, broken, could only weep. Her hot tears, the last vestige of her desperate love, rolled down her cheeks and fell onto Kai's face. They did not thaw him. They froze instantly, clinging to his blue skin like tiny, useless pearls of ice. He did not even blink. The queen smiled, a slow, cold curving of her perfect lips, revealing teeth that seemed carved from the same black ice as the throne. She saw Gerda's pathetic, frozen tears, her broken-hearted sobs, and she felt only the cold amusement of a scientist watching a lesser creature fail a test. "Your heart is so hot, little Gerda, so full of that burning, useless passion." She leaned in, her voice a conspiratorial, venomous hiss. "Only the hottest love can thaw him." And she waited, her eyes glittering, knowing full well that Gerda, in her desperate, animalistic love, would misunderstand the riddle in the most beautifully destructive way possible. The riddle hung in the frigid air, a cruel, final piece of a puzzle Gerda's broken mind struggled to assemble. Only the hottest love? She looked at the tiny pearls of ice, her frozen, useless tears on Kai's cheek. She looked at his perfect, pale, unfeeling face, his hand still hovering over the ice shards of eternity. Her love was a fire, yes, but it was an internal one. A kiss was not hot enough. A tear was not hot enough. The queen's cold, expectant amusement was the final clue. This was not a fairy tale test of emotion. It was a literal, physical riddle. Her gaze drifted from Kai's face to the razor-sharp, crystalline tools of his new existence. She understood. A profound, sickening clarity settled over her, a calm that was more terrifying than her panic. It was not a metaphor. Heat. Not the abstract warmth of affection, but the wet, visceral 100-degree heat of the life pumping inside her. The queen, with her talk of messy emotions, had shown her the way. Gerda looked at her own hands, raw and red, and then at Kai's chest, where his heart lay still and frozen. She knew what she had to do. It was not an act of heroism. It was a final, horrific act of possession, a desperate, animalistic need to prove that her messy love was more powerful than the queen's sterile perfection. Her movement was a shocking explosion of chaos in the silent, ordered throne room. She didn't embrace Kai. She tackled him, crashing into his still kneeling form with the full weight of her despair. He fell backward onto the icy floor, his head striking the ground with a dull crack, but his face remained placid, registering only a physical interruption to his task. The queen watched, her smile widening fractionally. She believed this was a final, pathetic, desperate plea for a kiss, a last futile attempt to impose her warmth on his coldness. She was wrong. This was not an appeal. It was an assault. With a guttural sob that was more animal than human, Gerda scrambled on top of him, straddling his waist. Her hands, clumsy with frostbite, fumbled for the shards of his puzzle. She seized one. It was a long, tapered sliver of black ice, its edges honed to a monomolecular sharpness by the queen's will. It was as cold as the void, but it was a tool. She held it over her own body, her eyes locked on Kai's. His were empty, logical, and blue. He was watching her, but he was not seeing her. He was simply processing this new chaotic data. "I love you," she gurgled, the words thick with a final desperate venom, and she plunged the ice shard deep into her own stomach, just below the ribs. The cold of the ice was a searing white-hot shock, a pain so profound it was almost electrical, instantly vaporizing the skin and muscle it touched. But it was immediately met by the gushing internal heat of her own body. The queen's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion in her perfect icy eyes. This was not part of the game she had envisioned. This was messy. This was wrong. Gerda screamed. It was not a sound of pain, but a raw, wet, triumphant bellow of agonizing effort that finally shattered the oppressive, perfect silence of the palace. The sound echoed, distorted and ugly. She didn't stop. She didn't pull the shard out. With a final, horrific act of will, a last testament to her suffocating, all-consuming devotion, she gripped the shard with both hands and pulled it upward, splitting herself open from navel to sternum, a grotesque act of self-dissection. The sound of her own body tearing was the loudest thing in the room. A wave of hot, steaming, dark red life erupted from her. It was not a trickle. It was a deluge, and in her final dying second of strength, Gerda lunged forward, collapsing onto her brother. She pressed her gaping, steaming wound, this final, horrific embrace, against Kai's frozen, blue-skinned chest. It was a grotesque, sacrificial perversion of an embrace, a baptism in her own hot blood, forcing her life onto him. She was not just thawing him, she was staining him, marking him forever with her sacrifice. The smell of hot copper and iron filled the cathedral of ice, a primal organic stench that was an abomination in this sterile place. The sudden, violent, visceral heat of her gushing blood did what her tears and kisses never could. The ice encasing Kai's heart, the queen's perfection, could not withstand this biological, messy assault. It did not melt slowly. It shattered. It exploded inside his chest with the sound of 1,000 breaking mirrors. And Kai screamed. It was his first real sound. Not a word, not a cry, but a raw, agonizing, primal shriek as sensation, pain, terror, and the memory of her love returned to him in one agonizing, scalding, traumatic rush. He was warm again, and it was the worst pain he had ever known. The queen's face, for the first and only time, contorted. Her amusement was gone, replaced by a look of profound, cold, bottomless disgust. This was chaos. This was gore. This was the antithesis of her perfect, clean, logical world. Gerda, in her final act, had not just ruined herself, she had ruined him. The toy was broken. The perfection was soiled irrevocably by this messy, passionate, imperfect display of blood and self-mutilation. The queen did not fight. She did not speak. She simply vanished, recoiling from the scene, her perfect plaything now a contaminated, screaming, ruined thing. Gerda was already dead. The last of her life had poured out of her, her purpose fulfilled. Her body, exsanguinated and suddenly freezing, went limp, a hollowed-out shell collapsing in her brother's arms. Her hot blood began to cool instantly, turn into a black, sticky, frozen crust on Kai's chest, sealing her to him. He was saved, but his eyes were wide, not with relief, but with a new, permanent, screaming horror. He was clutching the cooling, mutilated corpse of his sister, her open stomach pressed against his, the memory of her final, violent act seared onto his retinas. He was not the boy who had left the cottage. That boy was gone forever, buried under the ice and now drowned in blood. The boy who stumbled out of the ice palace, which already seemed to be groaning, its purpose complete, its structure dissolving, was a ghost. He was warm again, but he was irreversibly traumatized, clutching the psychological splinter of the queen's coldness, a trauma now forever fused with the image of his sister's self-destruction. He had been rescued from a cold, logical void, only to be plunged into a new, hot, emotional one, a world of guilt and nightmare from which he would never, ever escape. He would live, he would grow old, but every winter he would feel the phantom cold in his heart, a cold that was no longer the queen's, but his own. He would see her face, not as she was when she protected him, but as she was in her final bloody moment, her eyes wide, her teeth bared, her love a weapon she had turned on herself to claim him. He had been freed from one prison only to be locked in another, a cell built from his sister's love, its walls cemented with her blood. He was finally and truly her little brother forever. And so the ice palace melted, and the story was buried. The world chose to remember the lie, the glittering fantasy of empowerment and gentle, sisterly kisses. It was a much more comfortable tale, but Kai knew the truth. He knew that the void had a name, and that it was patient. He knew that true, desperate love isn't a gentle thaw, it is a fire. And like any fire, it doesn't just warm, it burns, it consumes, and it leaves a scar that can never, ever be mistaken for perfection. The ice shard in his eye was gone, melted by his sister's heat. But the other shard, the one she had plunged into her own body, was now his to carry. He would feel its phantom edge in his own stomach for the rest of his life, a cold, sharp reminder of the price of his salvation. He had escaped the queen, but he would never, ever be free of Gerda and the knowledge of what her love was truly capable of. Now you know. You know what was buried beneath the snow, beneath the songs, beneath the comforting lies. You know that some monsters are not defeated. They are simply fed, and the void is always, always waiting, hungry for a heart that is perfectly still, or one that is hot enough to burn itself to ash. Good night.